Today we are joined by Professor Grant Schofield, who is a scientist and low carbohydrate diet advocate. In his own words, he specializes broadly based in public health, especially the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. The way lifestyle can be used either as medicine or to prevent these problems in the first place has been the focus of my research career. In this episode, we discussed how carbohydrates are problematic for humans, how red meat has been wrongly villainized, whether refined carbohydrates or seed oils are the primary driver of many of these diseases we are seeing, as well as whether or not carnivore is better than a more stereotypical ketogenic diet that still includes low carbohydrate vegetables. Awesome. So, Professor Schofield, you are a low carbohydrate advocate. Why do you believe it is so essential for humans to at least minimize or reduce carbohydrates completely from their diets?
Yeah, Max, I don't know about everyone having to eliminate them completely, but first of all, it's not an essential nutrient. And then in the way and the amount of carbs we've started eating and as a species over the last, I don't know, since we started processing food in the sort of modern way with factories, then what's happened is we've now have, many of us have the inability to reach what I will call normal metabolic homeostasis. So we can't, probably at least half the population is not really normalizing their glucose. But even if they do, they're not normalizing their insulin. So, there's probably about 5 key ways that diet can, potentially affect your health in a negative way. And by far the number one at the front of that is being able to maintain normal glucose and insulin homeostasis. In other words, return back to the normal state that you're supposed to be in. And when you can't do that, then everything is going to follow. So the cancer, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, neurological problems, mental health problems, basically 90% of what you see in the hospital or at the doctor's surgery is metabolic, and 90% of that is because we can't return ourselves to our normal state, and 90% of that is because we're over-consuming refined processed carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. From an obesity perspective, what do you think is the biggest problem with carbohydrates? Do you reckon it's the fact that we're not fat adapted, so we're constantly getting hungry? Is it these blood sugar spikes that are, when they crash back below baseline, people get hungry, they can't stop eating all day? What is it about carbohydrates that is making the population so fat, do you reckon?
Well, I think both of those are interesting processes, right? So actually, I think the second one is the most obvious one to run, which is reactive hypoglycemia. So you blood sugar goes way up, you overproduce with insulin. The more insulin resistant you are, the worse that is. And then you end up with after eating a meal, a couple of hours, you end up with a lower blood sugar than when you started. So now you're emotional and hungry. And so I think that drives overconsumption and poor health. So that's the first thing. And I think that leads to overweight. And remember, that's half the people live like that. And then your second one probably needs a bit of unpacking, I think. You're not fat adapted. Yep, that's true. So I suppose there's just a whole. If you've got hyperinsulinemia, high insulin, then I think the most instructive part of that is, I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's called the OB mouse model, and these mice don't produce the hormone leptin, which you'll see how that's related to insulin and sugar in a sec. And so they just get, if you give them food, they just keep eating until they died, basically. But even when they're on half rations, they still become obese. And you haven't even apparently got enough rations to survive on, but you're now accumulating fat, and you're doing it at the expense of muscle, brain, and organ development, and you've stopped moving around. And then you inject these mice again with leptin, and away they go. And so this was an interesting target in the 1990s when it was discovered, because they said, oh, well, if you've got obesity, we'll inject you with leptin, you'll sort your hunger out, you'll manage your energy partitioning, and you'll be just fine. And what they discovered then was that, in fact, obese people were already secreting leptin at 2 or 3 times the rate of lean people, but they had what we call leptin resistance. And I think we now know that insulin interferes with leptin signaling. So when you've got constantly high glucose from ultra-processed foods and carbs, and you've got high insulin as a consequence, then your brain can't see leptin, and you're essentially like that OB mouse model. You stop moving, And now, even with low amounts of energy, you're still preferentially storing it as fat at the expense of brain, muscle, and organ development. So, yeah, I think that's probably the primary thing. I think the problem in the field is, as you'll be well aware, there's such this I don't know what they call it, sort of dualistic thinking. It's either calories
Hmm.
or it's nothing to do with calories. Of course, calories are a thing, like they are a unit of energy.
Yeah.
And anyone who's got a dog who's really got no control of his calories, that's over to you, knows if you just change the calories they eat, they'll change their body weight.
Hmm.
But it doesn't explain the behavioral side and the fact that hunger and satiation is driven by protein and fat, and in a positive way, and hunger is driven by these peaks and troughs of blood sugar, and then constantly high insulin. So you end up with this sort of people arguing completely across each other. Once someone's arguing down the bottom of the room and someone's arguing up the top of the room, and they don't even hear each other. And so
Hmm.
that's definitely a factor in the field.
Yeah, no, you've hit the nail on the head right there. You've definitely got one crowd which argues it does not matter at all what you eat. You know what I mean? A calorie is a calorie, and you have all these satiation problems. People are never full, and they overeat as a result of that. And then
Yeah,
on the other end, you have people completely ignoring the fact that fat is stored energy. So
yeah,
it's
100%.
a bit of a crazy contrast between the two groups. So if we
Yeah,
take out the carbohydrates, obviously, we need to replace them with something, which is typically meat, right? A lot of
yeah,
people are under the assumption, well, they've had it reinforced their entire lives that red meat, cholesterol, the saturated fat from it is problematic. When you look at it from a very, simple point of view, you can go, well, we've always eaten red meat. In 1905, we introduced processed foods. 1906, Alzheimer's becomes a thing. 1912, the first heart attack recorded in the United States happens. 1930s, heart disease seemingly comes out of nowhere. Well, it becomes the leading killer, I should say, when in the 1900s there was none of it. Cancer,
yeah.
1 in 17 people got it in the year 1900. Now it's nearly 1 in 2. So all of these diseases have, either completely come from nowhere or the rates of them have increased monumentally. Yet people are still blaming the one food we've always eaten. So I think I know your opinion on this, but I'd love to hear it from you.
Well, I think you're right, but it's probably even more instructive to go back into the previous century, I think, because what we what I would say is that the plant-based idea of plant-based eating, and that meat was a problem for our health. And you'll know this, but it just needs saying again, because this isn't conspiracy. This is just a fact that Ellen White, when she started the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and then Kellogg's work at the Battle Creek Sanatorium, the really idea was that meat invigorated you, gave you sexual urges, particularly around masturbation, which they felt was really the cause of most illnesses. Uh, it's an interesting idea, but I suppose you've got to start somewhere with your hypothesis. And so, they're really looking for foods that made you feel less invigorated, and that's where cornflakes originally came from. Then I think it was so unpalatable that they started to put sugar back in it, and that was a bit of a rift in the Kellogg's family. But yeah, the sort of religious Puritan overlayer on it, and sort of we're not going to have sex type thing, um, really put it into the food of the devil, because it made you feel invigorated, which is just a weird thing. So just put that in the background. And then the Adventist Church and their work and starting the American Dietitians Association in the early 1900s was really pushing towards plant-based, and then away from meat, and then of course you replace it with something, and then grains and whatnot started to be a thing. And so I think that's just proliferated, and now it's got caught up in the climate change arguments, cows and methane, and despite the hypocrisy of the whole species, if only we've sorted cows out, then the planet would be better off, which is complete rubbish so far as I can tell. Although I have to say I'm no expert in um, carbon emissions or whatever even that
Mhm.
means. But
Never mind the other animals. It's just the cows, apparently.
well, that's right. So even like, I don't really like going around just randomly killing animals, but yeah, what becomes a sentient being, and then you scientifically go and look at the evidence for red meat, as it exists in terms of the fresh category, fresh meat rather than processed meat. I don't think anyone's advocating for the category that is processed meat, which is, I don't know if you even remember those categories called luncheon sausage and whatever you get you're going by a frankfurter,
Hmm.
may contain meat. I don't think anyone regards those as the category that we're talking about. But fresh meat as it exists in animals that were recently alive, I probably the same as you widely regard that as a health food, and it seems a shame that it's been demonized into not being one.
Mm. What do you think is the problem with all of these sort of, professionals, the nutritionists, the doctors, the mainstream opinion? I would go so far to say that 90% of, professionals in that space, they're still under this notion that red meat is harmful for us. When I was 19 years old, when I was growing up, my entire life, I was told red meat is bad for me. And then I understood, this concept of healthy user bias and how all these
Yeah,
association studies had all these other factors that made it seem
yeah.
like red meat was bad, but there was no actual evidence of red meat itself being the causative factor. So when I was 19 years old, I came to the conclusion, okay, everything I was taught, it was wrong. There's no evidence for this. Yet, even despite this, all these professionals, they're highly intelligent individuals for the most part, yet they're still under the notion that red meat's bad for them. Why do you think this is the case?
Well,
If you're enjoying this interview and you want to see more carnivore related content like this, consider subscribing down below. The more subscribers we get, the more big interviews with special guests that we can do.
there's a famous psychologist from the 50s called Leon Festinger, and he was the one who came up with the idea of cognitive dissonance, that we have a great deal of difficulty changing our minds to admit we were wrong, because that really damages our ego. And he wrote an excellent book called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Us. And I think in science, we have a great deal of difficulty, and medicine's even worse. The inertia in that is so strong. And I think it was one of the physicists in the mid 20th century said, science advances one funeral at a time, because once a scientist has a hypothesis, they don't change that. And the diet heart hypothesis, and then its little brother around saturated fat, the lipid hypothesis, was the predominant dietary hypothesis for the last 50 years. And things are changing, I think, but for that to make it into medicine and healthcare in general is a pretty long thing. And they talk about the medical half-life as being 40 years, before something's discovered that actually makes a real difference and it coming into practice. I think it's probably halved now, and we're certainly ahead of where we were, I don't know, 20 years ago. You got to remember, if you go back 20 years, and you'd go to a barbecue and people wouldn't even serve butter. It would be that polyunsaturated vegetable oils and partially hydrogenated stuff, just awful margarines and things. And so we've moved on from that. So I think there's been some movement, but I think the meat thing's the last of them. And because, I don't know, there's a large ruminant animals you're killing, and there's a whole green, I don't know, environmental layer there as well. It's a little bit harder to unpack.
Mm,
I'd also say that there's another whole layer of the pharmaceutical industry that sort of follow where the money in medicine comes from, and it's not from broccoli or steaks,
yeah.
or it's from statins and hypertensive and metabolic medicines. This GLP-1 drugs, Ozempic and stuff. It's a couple of weeks ago that Novo Nordisk, which is the Danish company that owns that drug, overtook Tesla as the most valuable company by market capitalization in the world. So, when the most valuable company, and we're talking in the trillions now, and the world is a weight loss drug, you're probably not going to see market forces prevail in favor of some of the things that we would believe scientifically to be true.
Yeah, it's a very insane to me how so many people have such a like trust the science approach to absolutely everything when there's a 10-to-1 ratio of studies funded by companies with agendas in comparison to
Yeah,
the governments, and even the governments, often the boards of the scientific
that's
research
exactly right.
groups, they're basically lobbied as well. So it's a
Yeah.
very, very interesting thing. I'd love to ask you as to what you think the primary driver for many of these illnesses is, whether it's carbohydrates or seed oils. Because with seed oils, I've got it written down here, the exact process they go through. I don't leave anything out. So obviously, first it's from a seed, which is the most offended part of a plant. We know plants have these defense compounds, and so they heat the seed up, press it, they mix it with solvents and other chemicals, bleach it, deodorize it, and further refine them. And then they become oxidized when they're exposed to oxygen and so they go through these processes, and it clearly makes them not very healthy for us, to put it very simplistically. What do you think these right here, the leading driver of disease, or would you say it's carbohydrates?
I, I think it makes it's pretty hard to separate the two in the sense that if you go down to the supermarket and you know cruise up next to someone's trolley and have a look inside it and look at what's in there,
Hmm.
which I'm prone to do from time to time. I'm not sure about you, and you think, oh my gosh,
Uh-huh.
then those two items are so intrinsically
Mm.
linked, right? So you go, okay, well, there's the first packet in there. Trolley is Doritos. Okay, well, what's in Doritos? Well, both of those, right? And then you just go, and when you start to look at ultra processed food, then you're really talking about a combination of um, these partially hydrogenated and then just unstable vegetable oils. Everything's cooked in vegetable oils. Well, I shouldn't be saying vegetables, you seeds, right? That's not even
Mhm.
accurate. There's no vegetables involved.
That's their
Um,
marketing.
yeah, that's right. Sounds healthy,
Vegetable,
doesn't
healthy guys, come on,
it? Yeah,
vegetables,
yeah,
that can't be bad for you.
yeah. But then you've got the refined carbohydrates as well. So you can imagine two processes where that high amount of omega-6 is inflammatory, that causes insulin resistance. You chuck in um, lots of refined carbohydrates, and then you've got uh, impaired glucose and insulin tolerance under inflammatory conditions. So, I don't even know if anyone's ever going to be able to unpack that. So I think, probably the easiest thing is just to call the whole lot of them ultra processed food and say it's all crap, and be done with it. And maybe we should just avoid both. But probably, you're right. The processed seed oils don't get as much attention in the scientific literature. I think they've come a long way in terms of understanding about glucose and insulin homeostasis. I mean, it's most people even understand, even in mental health now, that the primary risk factor for many mental health conditions is just elevated blood glucose. It's hard to measure elevated seed oils in the blood because it doesn't work quite that same way. You'd have to somehow assay things in ways that aren't common.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting how it seems to be almost everything is caused by diet. We've even got Chris Palmer from Harvard, who's prescribing keto diets to people with depression, anxiety, and it seems to clear up. And you've got cases like Jordan Peterson, who have this chronic depression. They change their diet, it vanishes, and they eat something again, their depression comes back. I've heard so many stories like that around the carnivore community. So it's a very, very fascinating field.
Yeah, there's another whole thing going on there. So at the start of this, I said, so I reckon one way that's handy to think about diet from time to time is because people fall into different categories. So I reckon when I think about it, I reckon there's five big ways. There may be others, but five big ways that we can think about in it, about how diet affects your health. And the first time we've talked about, which is that big one, just impaired homeostasis, and that ultra processed food disease, impaired insulin and glucose homeostasis. But the next big one, which I think the carnivore community is really familiar with, is that sometimes stuff either gets into your gut or into your bloodstream, and for one reason or another, on some people it's fine, their body deals with it as food. For other people, the immune system responds and says, "Hey, this isn't food. I need to attack and kill this stuff." And so that's the whole class of food sensitivities through autoimmune problems. I think carnivore is interesting there because it's pretty much the ultimate elimination diet of that, and things that you'd think would be healthy because they've been labelled as such. People have problems with things like peppers and potatoes, tomatoes, that whole nightshade category. They get rid of that, their rheumatoid arthritis just disappears. They just get down to the basics like meat, and you'll see your Michaela Petersons, your Jordan Petersons, and actually more recently, I heard Peterson interviewing Elon Musk and talking about the back pain with his wife and stuff like that with the carnivore diet as well. So that's another whole category, right? So there's two of the five. The impaired homeostasis, the sensitivity and autoimmunity. The next one is just got insufficient nutrients, and so there's essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, and all of your micronutrients, and food, even animals raised in feedlot farming and stuff, that they don't have the same amount of nutrients in them as they have in previous generations. So if you follow something like a cauliflower that they've been measuring this stuff in for 100 years, it's just completely fallen off the planet. Most of us get nowhere near enough protein. Probably another reason the carnivore people do all right, because you end up actually consuming a reasonable amount of protein, which is great. So there's three. A fourth is just stuff that isn't food, that's in the food supply, like I don't know, examples are bisphenols in plastic containers for food that disrupts estrogens, or glycophosphates. And I think most of the recent science is saying if we melted down a dead human, we get about a credit card of microplastics out of their system, which is an astonishing thing. And then the fifth is that there's just some people have genetic differences that in the way they process nutrients, and the most well known for this are things like vitamin B. Remember, B vitamins which are also, which are plentiful in animal products. One spin of the electron transport chain in a mitochondria, B vitamins are used over 34 times, and that's happening trillions of times every hour in your body. And some people can't take forms of B12 and B6, and they need a methylated form of this, and it gets complicated. But some people just can't process nutrients in the same way as other people can, and they need different forms. So those are the five big ways that I think about food and health. And there's some. I think the carnivore one's interesting because for some people it completely changes their life in a way that was utterly unexpected, in ways that they've struggled with for their whole life and been able to get any decent medical advice on. They suddenly switch to a much more simplified, whole food diet just based on animal products, and they're like, wow, I feel normal again. And you look across those five things, they're able to have effects across many of those five plausible ways.
That's what I wanted to ask you about with the carnivore thing. If we look back 12,000 years ago and prior, before we started agriculture, and we had these strictly carnivorous diets, we see the fossils had very little lesions and markings, indicating that they had very little disease. Then we start agriculture, and ever since then, we've seen decline in height, decline in brain size. Our fossils have these lesions and markings on them, suggesting that disease and infection has become more rampant since we switched from our species-appropriate diet. We know plants contain, these things like lectins, tannins, which are incredibly problematic, especially in some individuals. And now, if we can get every single nutrient we need in meat, so we're getting all of the good, but they don't have these toxic defense compounds, do you think that a carnivore diet is the optimal human diet?
I think about that a lot because personally I'm quite a fan of carnivore. I like doing it. It's not always practical for me, but if I think if I was just living on my own or just with my wife, I'd probably just go for that, and I delve into it from time to time because I generally feel fantastic. I'm energized, hunger's sorted out, inflammation's down, I'm away. I sort of by and large agree with what you're saying about the human diet being well, it's clear it's primarily meat based in the sense that that was the only way of getting sufficient energy to have a brain of our size. And I think you're also right. Remember, it was 1,500 cubic centimeters prior to the agricultural revolution, and it shrunk down to 1,200. It hasn't unshrunk. I'm not sure what that means exactly. But you did say an interesting where there's some people. So it's an interesting thing, right? So there are three four sort of ancestral diets that have recently been, in the last 100 years, people have studied, and Stephenson with the Inuit through the early 1900s, great book. So these are people that don't touch a plant ever. There's no plants growing to touch, and it's a pretty high fat, moderate protein type situation. And if they don't get enough fat, then they'll end up with rabbit starvation and they'll wither away. But they're thriving people, so there's that group of people. Equally, there's I don't know, something like the Maasai, so meat based, but it's also high fat dairy, pretty animal based, and big tall people thriving. Interesting, not far from them though is the Hansa, and it's a whole food diet. They actually get a truckload of fiber through pretty shitty vegetables, and so that's them. And then there's, I can't remember the name of the group, but if you go up into Papua New Guinea, where it's pretty tropical, not quite so much of a meat supply once you get into the jungle, they're quite high sort of fruit and fiber based, and they seem right. They're all of these groups are free of chronic disease. I bet you. So I mean, no, this is a thought experiment, Max. No one's doing this study, but what if you randomize each group to each other's diet? Chuck the Hansa on the Inuit and the Inuit on the Hansa. I reckon each group would only do well on its own ancestral diet, which is an interesting thing. And so maybe there's some adaptations across species. I think for our phenotype, which is primarily, we're probably from people who lived in Europe, we're going to do pretty well on a meat-only diet. Pretty hard winters, plenty of animals to catch, particularly gamey ones. So, I think we'll do well. Be interested to see, I think that's the great unknown, is which people will completely thrive on the meat only, and are there other specific adaptations? I just don't know the answer to that. So I think it's paleolithically, it's we started out on a meat-based diet, but it's pretty clear in some parts of the world we started to forage off into whatever we can get our hands on. I don't know what that means for human health, or if anything, or maybe they just all thrive on meat only. Who knows?
Yeah, my argument against the people of the Hadza and those tribes that do have the plants in there would be that even though they're eating organically, so they're not having these seed oils and all the other garbage, the emulsifiers and that, they're only still living to 80. And we know human potential is 120. So there's clearly some inflammation or something going on there which isn't allowing them to live their full lifespan. Would you agree with that?
So, I don't know.
Kind of hard to speculate on, I guess.
I don't know. About that sort of 120 thing. Like I do all this work in the remote Pacific, and people were just eating their fish, and these are people who they were still fundamentally better off, right? So people live to their mid-70s. They have what you call an idiopathic death, so they're just living, and then they're not. They basically die in a week or two. They're working in the community till the end. They sort of wore out a bit in many ways, like it's just like there were skeletal things, and I don't know, but they were eating whole food, not too much fiber, but heaps of fish and stuff. So maybe that's one. I don't know. Hard to know how to answer that. Like, it'd be great to do this as an experiment.
Yeah, exactly.
People in there, but
it's hard being. I can imagine it's very hard for you being a scientist and trying to make these conclusions based on very little data. So I apologize for putting you in the uncomfortable position.
No, I don't think so. But it's like on one hand, you've got this ridiculous situation, which we've just talked about, that the whole scientific community going, not only is this not a health food, it's actually bad for you. It's going to send you to an early grave. We're going, well, that's clearly not a thing. In fact, some people go carnivore, and like not only do they do better, they thrive when they were quite ill before that. So we celebrate that part as all being true, and then it goes, well, what if you ate nothing but meat as a population? It's like, I suppose, but then there are people who seem to do it right, who have eaten other stuff. So how do you unpack that? I don't know where to start there, frankly.
Yeah, no, it is a very complicated one.
Yeah,
but I think we can both agree that sort of now vegetables are definitely getting worse and worse for us. They're grown the same soils over and over. these soils are sprayed with pesticides. The plants themselves contain monumental amounts of pesticides, and now they're making them essentially more pest resistant. They know they have these defense compounds, but they're still getting attacked by predators. So they essentially crossbreed them to make them more and more defended. So
Yeah.
every single crop of vegetables we have nowadays is not only having less nutrients in it, but it's having more of the, I guess, bad stuff, to completely oversimplify it again. So would you be in agreement with me that it's vegetables are getting worse by the vegetables and fruits are getting worse by the day, and that
Yeah, well, they certainly don't resemble anything that they used to anciently look like in, Paleolithic times. Most of these weren't even things, and I think, if you've read things like William Davis's Wheat Belly and Grain Brain and these things, then you'll go, well, yeah, I mean, there's proteins in here that haven't even existed in human evolutionary history. That's part of the problem.
mm,
Then you get into these lectins and these sort of stuff. You've got to remember also, though, that there's the counter theory is that some of these things are polyphenols, and lectins and stuff aside, some of the polyphenols are actually toxic, right? Like
mm,
that, and their benefit is their toxicity if you can
mm,
adapt to them. That's the sort of idea of hormesis.
mm,
Um, but perhaps you chuck that in a modern environment, we're already stressed out and we're not getting nutrients otherwise, then a whole bunch of people can't deal with that. So
mm,
that's another plausible mechanism. The sort of phytates and lectins stuff, I think it's definitely a thing. I don't think it's a universal thing. Like some people can take them and they, okay, it depletes some zinc, but they're not zinc deficient for some reason. Other people are zinc deficient, and that's the end of that, and they've been depleted by that, and they stop eating those, and they come right. So I'm not trying to not support your hypothesis here. I just sort of feel that part of the problem, and you've got to take 6 of one, half a dozen of the other here. It's like we're critical of all the nutrition science that's been before us, which is fair enough. So then we get held to the same standard, and the science is so hard to do and still to be done. So
mm.
one of the things that most disappoints me is I know I won't be alive in 100 years' time, and man, it'd be awesome to look back in 100 years about what's been learned. So
Yeah,
it's something I think about, but with no real end point because I can't do anything about it. But
yeah. No, it's a very fascinating debate, and I think as time goes on, like you said, we'll see more and more data supporting different
yeah,
hypotheses, and we can
yeah,
come
yeah,
to more I guess better conclusions. So yeah.
yeah.
Awesome. Anyway, I think I appreciate your time greatly, and yeah, where can people find more of you? You've got these
Uh,
books.
yeah, so we've written quite a lot of books on low carb keto fasting. So just Google up Grant Schofield books, you'll see that. And yeah, our main stuff's at precure.com. So that's PREKURE.com. Prevention is cure, which has sort of been the thing I've been trying to stand for.
Yeah.
Better to be healthy in the first place.